So it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this new edition of our Skyline talk, and it is a particular pleasure to welcome Dr. Laurence Hillman, who is a global expert on archetypes, does corporate consulting internationally, and has been practicing astrology for over 40 years. Dr. Hillman was born in Zurich when his father, James Hillman, known as the father of archetypal psychology, was the director of the C.G. Jung Institute. Dr. Hillman specializes in helping his clients understand their deeper purpose and their life's calling, especially in these challenging times. In his role as a consultant, he helps leaders and organizations understand their archetypal patterns and advise on high-level decision-making in organizations. Dr. Hillman, welcome, and thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Nice to see all of you. Thank you.
You were born and raised in Zurich in a very Jungian household and chose to study architecture instead of psychology. And at very early in your life, you began to study astrology. What is the connection between astrology and architecture?
Great question. There's a couple of connections I could think of. One of them was that my teacher, my astrology teacher, who was a family friend of my parents, was a trained architect and also an astrologer. And he lived for many years in Kashmir and built buildings there and practiced astrology at the same time. So I kind of had that combination as a model. But also there's some more esoteric connections. We could say that both astrology and architecture concern themselves with meaning making and with beauty, and also are a mixture of both science and art. There's a scientific component to architecture and an artistic one, same for astrology. So I think then there's the little things like we talk about houses in astrology, and there's those kind of literal connections. But it really is, to me, a way of seeing the world. I remember when I was studying architecture, I went to lunch with my best friend from high school who was studying medicine. We both started at the same time. And we both realized that we see the world differently now. Like I knew I could never look at a building again without thinking about its structure and how it was built so it doesn't fall down. It was like an X-ray thing, and it took away some of the just admiring the beauty, because I had to see, And he said, well, when I look at you, I think about, if I cut you up, where all the muscles will be. So he just learned that. So it was kind of a moment of realizing how your education also can change your perspective on just recognizing something. So it's a long answer, but that would be my connection between the two.
So we could say architecture and astrology both are concerned or interested in structure and in bringing an order to a system.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ordered system that is highly creative between the structure, right?
So what is the difference between an astronomer and an astrologer?
I have been at the grocery store and gotten into a conversation with someone, and they say, what do you do? And I say, I'm an astrologer. And they say, oh, do you have a... First they ask me if I work for NASA, or then they say, oh, do you have a telescope in your backyard? I mean, it's hard to see the difference. I'm glad for the question. I'm going to answer it with a very short story. Two children from the country, never been to a city, they're invited to New York, to Broadway, and they're invited to a musical, to a phenomenal play. And they're sitting in the front row, and they're overwhelmed with the visuals and what they're experiencing. One of them wants to know, sees the curtains open and close and the coulisses going up and down and the things moving on the stage and the lights and the sound, and it just wants to figure out all the mechanics, looking behind the curtain, who's doing what. The other one wants to know the meaning of the play. Not one is right and one is wrong, but the first one is the astronomer, the other one is the astrologer. The astrologer seeks meaning in the planets. So it's a question of what do they mean, not what are they. We use the same math to calculate the same thing, about where they are and positions and things like that. But I'm not really interested in the specific density of Pluto, but I'm interested in the meaning of Pluto.
Synchronicity describes, according to Jung, circumstances that appear meaningfully related yet lack a causal connection. Would you say, in other words, all is one and thus all is connected?
So, a sort of esoteric or even spiritual view of the universe is that there is a oneness. Most belief systems in the world agree that there is no separation. Everything is real. Separation is an illusion. So if we believe that for a moment, then we think of oneness, then there is no separation between you and me, or the planets and me, or the rock in the field. It's all one system. So if I'm trying to understand human behavior and human interactions, which is what astrology seeks to do, why do we do what we do, then having that's a complex thing to try to understand, to put a model on it. But if I believe that human behavior is part of this oneness, then I can go over here where there is some structure and some order, which is in the movements of the planets. It's the only thing I have said, and I still argue that, and nobody's ever countered me. It's really the only thing that we know for sure is where the planets are going to be tomorrow. That we know. Which is why every calendar is always set after moon or solar cycles, and it's the one thing that is constant that we know. And people have been writing down the movements of the planets in this consistency for 5,000 years since the Babylonians. So it's the oldest way of understanding this oneness in my mind. And so then we can make a synchronistic connection by saying what's over here is also going here. If I can understand this structure that is measurable and precise, I can also understand this weird thing called human behavior. They are connected through synchronicity, not causally. The planets aren't doing anything to me. It's not, the moon moves and my arm goes up and down. That's not how astrology works. It's a synchronistic connection. It's understanding that by looking in one place, I can understand another place.
Now, if I'm not wrong, every astrological analysis is based at the precise moment and the precise place of birth.
Correct.
Why is this moment so determining for astrology?
So the idea is that the minute you take your first breath as a baby, you are independent technically from your mother. And you are, in that moment, an individual from this perspective. The idea is that Pythagoras had a lovely metaphor that kind of says the way I see it. And he said, at the moment of birth, we are stamped like wax by the heavens above. It's a beautiful image. And so our own sort of cycle, our inner cycles of life begin at that moment. And the idea is there's a reflection to the heavens that are exactly above us. And that has to do with location and time, because it's under a specific sky. So I was born under a specific sky, as there's a line in Shakespeare. And so this is the idea that we are connected. We can find that connection in the place and in the moment of our first breath. That's one of the core ideas of astrology. And the other piece that belongs there is the model of the acorn. You would say, well, why does the birth minute matter for the rest of your life? And by the way, you can do this for an event, when a building starts or when a marriage starts or anything, because it is a moment in time that then unfolds. And so that's the acorn idea. In the acorn, you have the whole oak tree, and not just its genetics and its, all of that, but you also have its beauty, its ability to give shade, and all these more esoteric qualities are in that seed. Same idea that in the chart, in the moment that is drawn up as a picture, like a seed, has the complete potential of the whole tree. But of course there's the environment. So if the tree is this big and a deer comes by and eats off a branch, then that part of the tree isn't going to grow, but another part is going to grow more. So it is a mixture of nurture and nature. Nurture is what you grow up into, and nature is essentially the sky above you. That's the model.
We will get immediately to Shakespeare, but let me ask you, can we say that there is one astrology, or are there different schools and approaches? And if yes, how did you develop your astrology?
Thank you. So I'll start with a sort of a tongue-in-cheek answer that in Harry Potter, maybe you remember that when he goes to get his wand, and the I forget his name, the guy who sells the wands in the wizard store, he says, "The wand finds the wizard." So I believe that there are lots of schools of astrology. Just like there's lots of schools of medicine, lots of schools of psychology, lots of schools of architecture, there's lots of different sort of overall. But what they all have in common is they all look at the sky and they all make meaning of the sky. So I found mine because my teacher, who was a family friend, whom I knew since I was a little boy, taught me the way that he learned. So it's one of those, and I believe that I found him because he was the wand I needed to have. So I don't believe in accidents. I believe things happen for a reason, and I don't also believe in mistakes. And so I'm curious to why things happen, not judging them for being right or wrong. Or I never use the words good or bad with my clients. If I do, I correct myself if I catch myself. It's not about good or bad. It's about what is and what does it mean. We are meaning-making creatures.
So today there are apps to get the current astrological data. You can actually put in your date of birth and place, and you get within 2 minutes an analysis. I suppose you work in a different way, that you calculate, and then I suppose talking is important, the dialogue. No?
Yes. No. It's first of all, there's an intuitive quality to doing an astrological reading. And while that scares some people, there's an intuitive quality to being a good doctor, there's an intuitive quality to being a good psychologist. It's not all just stuff you learn from a book. There's an intuitive quality to being a good economist. I mean, it's any, or teacher, any job. And so, sure, there are computer-generated astrology reports that you can buy for $20 online. They're fine, but they don't, for instance, they can't deal with contradictions. It's very common in the chart that you see this, and so you read on one page, all this stuff about this, then you turn the page, on the next page it tells you the opposite, and you say, well, this just doesn't work. Well, we're actually, as human beings, full of these inner opposites. It's incredibly common that we have inner voices, we're pulled in different directions, we have conversations with ourselves. This is completely normal. And so that synthesis ability is something that it takes a human being to do. So I see my work as helping people make meaning of their particular chart or situation or relationship or whatever they're in, to understand it, why.
I would like to transition to archetypes now with a Shakespearean quote. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They all have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Is this a key to archetypes?
Yes.
That many parts, but some predominant?
Yes. So the biggest piece that I deal with when I talk to leaders or people in astrology in general is that most of us are trained in a model of what I call typology, which is a simple way of understanding a person. You're an introvert, you're an extrovert is the simplest way of understanding people. We all have a need to sort of understand other people, and we use these terms freely. But they are very limiting, and any typology is always exclusionary. Because if I say I'm an introvert and you're not, now we're separate, we're different. Remember, I don't believe in separation, it's all really one. So this goes for saying, for sun sign astrology, I'm a Libra, I would never get along with an Aries. That's typology thinking. Enneagram is typology, Myers-Briggs is typology. These are problems for me because they are separating. We have enough separation in the world. The archetypal model is the same thing as an astrological model. It's just a different word for it, because the archetypal astrologer, like I am, sees the planets as archetypes, which means universal principles that everyone can recognize anywhere in the world. If you say mother, you can go to southern India or northern Alaska and everybody understands the archetype. So that's an archetype. It's a universal understanding. So what brings it all together is that we make meaning of the shall we say these different parts. And the archetypal model or astrological model looks at us as being multiple inside. Mm-hmm. We all actually say that when we talk about ourselves. We say, you know, a part of me wants this, a part of me wants that. We're torn inside into different directions. We have conversations with ourselves. How is that possible if we're singular, if we're a type? And so this multiplicity approach to the inner life is the key. And so we have these different, let's call them archetypes, because now we're getting into that model. Same thing as saying planets, but it's easier in companies when I work with leaders to talk about archetypes than planets. That's still a little scary. It's the same thing. So the archetypes, which just sounds fancy, is the model is that we have these 10 inner characters based on the 10 heavenly bodies that astrologers look at, and that they all have different, we have different preferences for them. So for some people, again, you could use the stage metaphor, as Shakespeare did, and we have a lead character. All 10 are on the stage, but we can have a lead character, and you recognize, and so we say, well, that's an angry person. I would say that person has very easy access to the warrior. They're always out front, mm-hmm. Being a warrior kind of thing. That's a part of them, though. And then maybe their nurturer, the part that is caretaking and feeding people and caring for people. Maybe the nurturer is in the back, off stage, sitting on the bench. As they say in America, they're benched, in sports. So what the work is to recognize your archetypal pattern, which is what is your preference for which characters, and how does that serve you, and how does it hinder you. The decks of cards that I handed out for you to take home are a way there's instructions in them. You can read how to do a self-assessment of what's your. Essentially, you can read the 10 what their key words are. You can say, well, this is not really me, or you can say, this is very much me. How comfortable am I? How uncomfortable am I? And so on. So that's kind of the model. It's a simple way to start playing with it. There is also a real assessment where you can answer 100 questions online mm-hmm. that we use mm-hmm. professionally, and that gives you an archetypal mm-hmm. pattern of how these 10 actors on this inner stage, how they step forward or not.
Mm-hmm. You have mentioned the warrior, mm-hmm. and one simple statement in an interview I've heard with you, I thought this makes absolutely sense, which is that in the corporate world it is mostly a person with a strong inner warrior who makes it successfully to the top and then discovers that what has brought him or her to the top is not what is required to effective leadership.
That's a great reminder, I think, for a lot of leaders. There is a common understanding in leadership that what got you here won't get you where you need to go, and that there's a learning process to go on, and what do you need to go further. And especially people who step out of middle management into leadership position often don't have any skills to do this new sort of responsibility. It's very different to be a leader than to be a manager. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so, in general, the understanding was for, maybe since the Age of Enlightenment, that warrior energy is the right energy to lead something. Most of leadership theory today in America, in the world, because we kind of lead leadership theory as well, most of leadership theory came out of the military. After World War II, leadership as a concept didn't really exist except from the military until 50s, 60s, 70s, where people started to ask about what do leaders really do. So, the whole leadership theory came up. But it started out as people coming back from the war and being given big jobs in corporations. And then it was a military approach, a warrior approach. Push harder if it doesn't work, kill the competition, fight, all these kind of ideas. That doesn't really work anymore in a modern world. It does, and many companies still do it. But there are other archetypes that, for instance, a simple model. The younger generation today wants to be supported. Ask any leader today, wants to be helped, wants to be developed, wants these kind of things. Don't just tell me to go do my job and then talk to me a year from now. Give me feedback every week, these kind of things. Very different generation that want different things. That's the nurturer. If you don't have nurturer, the part that cares, if you don't have the nurturer in your repertoire, if your nurturer is way backstage as a leader, your turnover is sky high in your business, which is, any leader will know, is really expensive. So that's the cost. So we talk about cost and benefits of learning these parts. But it doesn't mean that leader says, well, I just don't do that, because we say, well, actually, you have it in you. It's one of your 10 archetypes. Maybe you were told it's not good. Maybe you were told, boys don't cry or girls don't get angry, or these kind of things in your history. But we're going to show you how to develop this part of you in a program or with coaching to show you how to develop the nurture in you. That's what we do.
So in our times, we're expecting diversity in the corporate world, and rightly so. Are there gender differences in archetypes?
The answer is no. And again, everyone, I sometimes compare the archetypes to the human genome. They really are what unite us no matter where you go. We've done this work with yam farmers in Africa. I've talked to accountants in New Delhi. We've been all over the world with this work. And wherever you go, when you talk about archetypes, people get it. They love it because they immediately understand it. If you feel like it and you read the cards later and the key words, you will be able to respond to these words. You'll recognize them as part of your own repertoire. You might say, well, that's not me, that's the idea. Or I do that on a bad day, or that's not really what I like. Or, oh my gosh, this, and then ask your partners to do it. It's really a fun little way to think about yourself. So yeah, we have we have different skills that we can apply, but everyone has all of them. That's really the key.
Thank you. You work with important global companies, quite a number of Fortune 500 companies amongst your clients. How do you approach your executive coaching from an archetypal point of view?
I'll give you a practical example. Was working with a leader for a while who had a very, very high job, but he wanted to go even higher. He was, part of in a conglomerate. He was leading one big business, but there were a couple others, and there was one guy above him. He wanted that guy's job. So I said, okay. And he did this archetypal assessment, and he found out that his sovereign, which is kind of the royal part of you that comes from the heart and expresses like this to the world, was very low. So he's kind of very good at sales and at closing deals and a kind of a manager thing, but if you're the head of a big organization, you need to have a presence. So the sovereign for him was the archetype that he needed to be able to apply even for that position. So we worked on the sovereign in a coaching situation over many months, and I gave him exercises. There's specific things to do. There's a book. We've written, my partner and I have written a book that describes this method. This book here that describes, it's called Archetypes at Work, Evolving Your Story one character at a time. So we work on one character at a time with a person, specifically whatever archetype they need. Or someone who's always being walked over, You know, people are always, they're never listened to, they're ignored at every meeting, that kind of a person. We might work on their warrior, you know, stand up for yourself, be able to say what you want to say, have a firm voice. There's a lot of acting techniques. My partner, Richard Olivier, is the son of Laurence Olivier, the actor. And so he comes from an acting family. His mother, Joan Plowright, is also a well-known actress that probably everyone in here would recognize her face. And so he grew up in an acting world, and he's a trained theater director. So a lot of the work that we do with organizations and people is embodied language, because you learn the best when it's not just in here and, you know, and goes in one ear and out the other, but it's actually embodied. So we do a lot of physical stuff with people that's based on theater techniques to learn this new role that you're trying to get into that is in you, but it's not very well developed.
Shakespeare continues to be important in the work.
Absolutely, yes.
Last question from my side before opening to our guests. You were also looking at the scope and branding of a company, how it connects with the inner values practiced within. Are there different archetypes required for different companies? Is there one archetype of an ideal leader?
Okay, so the two-part question, I'll answer the last one first, about the ideal archetype for one leader. Again, what we know, and this has been researched, is that to be a good leader, you need good access to all 10. You need to be comfortable to step into any one of these 10 roles. That's what makes, and if you study the great leaders and you look at what they can do, you can see how they can do all those. They can change who they're talking to and what situation they're in, and consciously, they probably don't do it consciously, unconsciously step into all these different roles. That takes some training and some awareness of oneself. That is my first answer. And so there's always something that we can improve and become better at, a part of us. That, you know, the other part of the question was, so I got the ideal, I'm sorry, what was
about the branding.
Oh, thank you, the branding, yeah.
And the scope and the branding.
Right. So, yes, so organizations have, I'll give you a simple example. Organizations have a sort of a key archetype, like a center stage archetype of what they do, how they see themselves. First, I'm going to talk about the importance of that, and then about how maybe it would help if everyone who works there was on board with the archetypal image. So, because if they're not, you've got a problem. So for instance, let's take a simple example. A company, and we differentiate between the culture in a company, in an organization, and the service, or what they do. And so let's say a company sells alarms. So they, you know, there's a security company. So we have, you know, guys with dogs, and we have people with guns, and we put up alarm bells, and we'll come and protect you and defend you. And, you know, clearly what we do, what we sell is warrior, right? Okay. But the culture in the company can be, let's say, nurturer. We're a family business. We have, you know, lunch once a week for everybody. You can bring your kids to work. You know, if they're sick, we have a daycare for them. You know, it's a completely different culture to what they're selling. You flip that around, and what you're selling is nurturer. Then, for instance, that might be a home care company. You know, we'll take care of your parents. We'll go to their house. We'll feed them and wash them and clean the house and take care of them. But our culture is warrior. We're going to get every deal in town. We're going to be on the back of the yellow pages. Those are gone now. But, you know, we're going to be aggressive. We're going to kill the competition. The way we do business, our culture is going to be... So to recognize that, that's a simple example of two that are reversed. But when you recognize that in a company, we have a different set of a deck of cards for the culture work, then it really would help if everyone is on board with that image. Because if somebody's there and they think you're a nurturing company, but they're actually a warrior company in your external behavior, that's going to be a really bad misfit. And so then just understanding it can, I never think somebody should quit or get fired because they don't fit. It's about developing that part that you need to work here. So it's always a developmental process.
Great. So by opening to questions, in casual astrology, two people would meet. One would say, I'm a Libra, and the other one would say, I'm a Leo, but with archetypes, basically all 10 archetypes are within each person, but differently developed.
Correct. And so we do have preferences. And so what we do in a meeting, for instance, we sometimes take the cards and somebody will put, my three top, the ones I'm most comfortable is Explorer, Renegade, and Warrior. Those are my three top. I put them here. So when I'm sitting across from the meeting, I can adjust. If I'm good at what I do, and you have the manual here on how to do that, I would adjust my language according to your top preferences because I'm trying to get something across to you. You talk differently to the archetype you're speaking to. And that's when it gets really as an effective tool to get through to people. So we have in there scenarios, that you would, if you want to meet someone in that scenario that they're comfortable with, or what are the clothing that person might wear, what is the decor they might wear, what is the language they might use, what do you not say to somebody if you really don't want to aggravate them, if they have a certain archetype that they lead with. So it's a useful tool for that. But it's not the same, and of course sun sign astrology to me, doesn't mean a lot. If I say I'm a this, then it's like saying, my shoe size is a 10.5. It says something about me, but most stereotypes are really limited. So it doesn't say much because I know there's 9 other parts you're not talking about. And you're not talking about the moon or Mars or Mercury or Venus or, they're not part. You're just saying my sun sign. That's just, to me, it's too limited.
Thank you very much. Well, I get the impression we have only been scratching at the surface, and I suppose we have quite a number of questions. Who would like to start? Architecture?
Well, first of all, let me just say I have so many questions, and it's just incredible to be sitting here with you. And I'm slightly overwhelmed. So thank you for everything. But as a start, maybe could you talk a little bit about the relationship, if there is one, between astrology and spirituality?
Right. So I could turn around and say, what do you mean with spirituality? But I'm going to assume that it is what is outside of the rational world, or what is transcendental, what's not measurable, right? So there are lots of different ways to try to understand this other realm. To me, again, there's no separation, but we have a practical experience of the separation. For instance, when we're awake and when we're asleep, that's a separation, but we're sort of in that other world when we're asleep, or drunk or stoned or whatever people do to try to get to that other place. Ayahuasca, people do try all these ways to get away from the rational world. And to me, there are lots of paths, and there are lots of other ways to try to understand or read or make meaning of this other reality. Religion tries to do that, tarot tries to do that, astrology tries to do that. It's making meaning of what we can't measure. And I love other things as well, but I've decided to spend, this lifetime and maybe a couple more, learning astrology because it's extremely rich. And I also think it is, from what I have studied compared, it is the most, has the deepest power to really work, because it's not, because there is that mathematical part to it that is not negotiable.
But is it true, would you say, that astrology doesn't really figure into our education system, for instance, that there is, it seems like there's so much about how we grow up through our culture and nature and nurture and so forth that makes us, cling to an identity, and we are much more comfortable with simplistic explanations of how the world works. Is there, I'm not sure where I'm going with my question, if it is so much of a science, why do you think it doesn't figure greater in our overall?
It's a great question. The popularity of astrology comes and goes. There were times where all the popes and all the kings and everybody had their astrologers and listened to everything they said, and then they were all kicked out of the country because they got too much power. And it's just, there's a history here that goes on for millennia. Speaking of schools and learning, I have said many times that it's a tremendously powerful tool. If I was a teacher, I would want to know, Mercury is the part of us, the storyteller in archetypes, the planet Mercury, is how we think, how we communicate, how we talk, language. It's also the trickster. It's mercurial. The word mercurial comes from Mercury. You know, that idea, that part of us. So if I was to be a good teacher and teach reading, writing, communication, and these kind of things to a kid, if I knew something about their Mercury astrologically, I could train my voice, my tone of voice, my language, the words that I pick to match that kid's Mercury, which would make my education, my teaching 1,000 times more effective. I'm sure of that. I know that because I teach my students in astrology to adapt their language when they speak to a client according to the client's Mercury, which they see. And that changes the quality of the word. So it should be more involved, if you ask me. And unfortunately, because we are people who are well trained to think simplistically and put things in boxes of, of dualities and black and white and that kind of a thing, we don't. And so we want typologies and we want simplistic answers to things. This is a complex way of thinking, and it's much harder. And many people just, I don't want to deal with that. So unfortunately, but it's there, it's available. And one of the advantages of working with leaders, I have found, is that they usually have the ability or the vision to have, to understand complexity.
Mm-hmm. Sam, you're a mathematician and also very much focused, at least in part, on education. Did this awaken certain curiosities in you?
Some parts. So I thought, I was struck with something you said earlier, where you don't believe things happen by accident. You don't believe, there's any mistakes. And I see kind of where you're coming from, but part of, I think, the way I view the world is I view randomness as kind of a fundamental thing that we all exist in. And I was wondering if maybe how you think this idea of randomness factors in to the astrological view of the world.
Right, well, they're counterpoints, because randomness means that things just happen for no reason. And I believe everything has a reason. My whole work is about trying to figure out why, is to find the reason. And it's also different. It's a different approach. It's a different philosophy. It's a different set of glasses that to understand our reality. And my work as an astrologer is in the helping profession. So I'm answering people's questions, and I'm solving problems, helping people solve their problems for them. Not giving advice, but say, here's how you find the answer. And so if somebody has something happen to them and they want to know, there's an old saying, it goes back to Nietzsche, but it was made famous by Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor who became a Nazi hunter. But he said, we can take any what if we know why. And so again, this human need to answer, why is this happening to me? Why is this going on? Why is Putin doing what Putin's doing? Astrologers have tremendously rich answers to those kinds of questions. That's what we do. To me, everything that's happening in the world makes perfect sense. I don't wake up and wonder, why is this happening? Because I spend my life answering why. So to me, that has value, because it gives me an explanation that makes sense. Oh, okay, I get it. I'm a meaning-making person. I can make meaning of the event. Randomness doesn't not allow me to do that, because it just happened. I don't think Putin's actions are random at all, for instance. I understand the point of view. I understand the value of randomness for certain things, but it's just completely counter to my mode of view in the world.
Mm-hmm. I certainly see the value of finding meaning in any situation, in any action, in any relationship, regardless of how you got to there. Do you ever worry about, I suspect that your answer is going to be no, but do you ever worry about over-subscribing meaning or finding too much meaning in situations or in
I do worry about that, of course, because it happens all the time. And sometimes, a cigar is just a cigar. Absolutely. So yes, that's part of the problem, is trying to make, so again, there has to be some kind of a middle path of like, I don't look at the planets every day. I know plenty of astrologers who figure out every morning what their day is going to be. Never. That's not me at all. And people call me and say, well, can I come back next week? And I said, no, wait 6 months. Live a little, do life before you don't become addicted to this as a way of living. That's not what this is for. I don't predict the future. I can tell you about the weather. So I could tell you, for instance, astrologically, you're going to have a rainstorm in your life in October, but I don't know what you do with that. If you say, I hate the rain, I'm going to go hide under my pillow, or in Switzerland under my duvet until the rain is gone, or I'm going to go out and jump around in the puddles. That's free will. Of course you have free will. But the fact that you're going to be in a rainstorm, I can tell you, which can be useful if you want to plant a garden, for instance. So that's the kind of work where looking ahead in time you can do, but it's different than predicting, hey, you're going to have a rainstorm and you're going to drown. I don't do stuff like that.
Do you have any strategies for kind of finding the appropriate level of meaning to situations?
It's a good question. I hope it's experience and figuring out where a person is in their level of consciousness. I've had this conversation with my astrology colleagues for decades, literally. How much do you say to people when you see things? How much do people need to live before who the heck do you think you are to get in and tell people about these things if they have to experience them? So it's a very fine line, and I take my work extremely seriously and have a lot of conversations and reflections about the ethics of it. Mm-hmm. And it is a hugely useful tool for people who I get responses almost on a daily basis that, this insights changed my life because I got to now I get it, It's about, ultimately, I think, if we get past everything else, I think we are creatures who want to be seen. And the gift of an astrology reading that's done well is that people feel extremely seen for who they are. No judgment. This is who, oh my gosh, yes. How you've never met me before. How can you see me so clearly based only on the time and the place of birth? That's really the value of it to me, is that people get seen. We want to be seen as human beings.
I was wondering if, different types of leaders, right, especially between government or public sector and private sector, do you see different archetypes in those leaders, or are they more similar than one would think?
Oh yeah, I love watching television, just seeing the archetypes come alive. It's a lot of fun. And again, I keep in mind, so I never think of person is an archetype. You can't be an archetype. You have all 10 in you all the time. But what are you leading with? And so then it's particularly interesting, what are you hiding, or what are you not interested in, or what are you really awkward with, and that's a lot of fun. So yes, different leaders have different. Clinton was, for instance, brilliant with a nurturer. I mean, people felt like he was in their living room and he was talking to 10,000 people, and he had a tremendous ability for empathy. And again, I don't care about the politics. I do care about the politics, but it's secondary to me. It's secondary to me. What matters is that I see the archetypes and what they're good at, and what it takes to become, president or something like that. And where is the country? What is the reflection of a country? Because I believe every country has the government it deserves, as someone once said a long time ago. And so I don't look so much at the actual characters who are running things when I'm looking at politics, but I'm looking at what time are we in? What kind of time are we in that we have these kinds of leaders? So what's the reflection on the people who bring these leaders to power? What does it say about our time? And I try to make meaning of that, rather than it's about the specific leader. It's not. They've been put there. They're part of this much larger moment in time.
Could we attribute archetypal constellations to different cultures? Say, Mediterranean has a different structure than the Scandinavian.
Yes, we certainly can. I mean, again, what is considered to be a valuable archetype, in the culture, for instance. So yes, that's true. And sometimes there's a lot of discrepancy where you say, well, I guess I could say that here, but America likes to say that we love children, but we don't really put any money towards children, so it's just one of those things. So they say nurture is big, but not really demonstrated in the politics or in the policies. So that's a discrepancy that you can see right away. Or one culture says, well, we're very peace-loving, but then, you know, they build up a big army or something like that. So that would be a discrepancy. So those things I look for and I'm curious about. But in general, we have to be careful because we can stereotype very easily and say, you know, all Scandinavians are, or all Mediterraneans are. Again, I'm also interested in people who are different. So if you have a very strong nurture and you're born into a culture that is very warrior, you might really suffer. I've seen that many, many times. Because you don't fit in, you're not playing the parts that people want you to play, you're not interested in the things that the culture is telling you should be interested in because you're different. And so this can, again, give people the opportunity to be seen for who they are, independent of their environment and culture.
Please.
You just said that you can actually see in what period a country or people is in when you see how they behave and then what leaders come up in that particular situation. Now we are living here in a rather worrying and difficult polarized situation in the United States. What do you make of that?
That takes a longer answer, but I'll try to make it short, which is not easy for me. But the biggest shift, maybe you've all heard or at least seen the movie or the play Hair, but this is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. This is really the backdrop against which I understand everything that's happening. And what it simply means in very simple terms is that for about the last 2,000 years, we were collectively, human beings together, were in the age of Pisces, the previous age, and now we're moving into the Age of Aquarius, so we're kind of hybrid right now. You know, starting in the Age of Aquarius, but still in the Age of Pisces with both. And when you know how to read the symbols that are going on, which is what we do as astrologers, then you start to see those things actually manifesting. So the Aquarian things are happening. The internet is the strongest thing that is Aquarian so far, which is networking, whole different model. The simple shift for understanding the time, and then I'll tell you why I think the separation is going on that you see everywhere. But the simplest way that I explain this is I think that the last 2,000 years we can take as a model of how we structure ourselves as human beings of a pyramid. And there's traditionally there's usually a guy at the top, and that could be the Pope, can be a general, can be a CEO, can be, you know, anybody all the way down to the people, the masses at the bottom of the pyramid. It's a singular person, usually a man, and when there's power involved, usually a white man. That's just historically true. That model gives, you know, is a power structure, and it's a hierarchy. In the Aquarian age, that model no longer works at all. The model for the Aquarian age that I see when I think about it is that of a three-dimensional matrix. Lots of different dots that are connected. It's a whole different model. Everyone is a node on that matrix. We all are involved in our own networks and connected with other people in ways that we never were before.
Wikipedia.
With media all across the world. And as a human being, I have a new responsibility. In a pyramid, my responsibility is to, as they say in the corporate world, is to kiss up and kick down. You know, that's my job. In the three-dimensional matrix, my job is to be responsible for the information that I take in, which is massive from all my networks, be responsible at how I pass it on. Like a stafette, I remember what that's called in English, like a relay race, right? So like a relay race. And so my responsibility as an individual in the new world is to be responsible for how I convey on the information that I take in. That's a completely different model. So I've written a little article somewhere that says, imagine being a pyramid-based leader who is used to this hierarchy, trying to manage a company in this Aquarian age. You are completely not equipped to deal with this because it's a different way of leading. And even the question of what does a hierarchical leadership mean is one that's highly debated and really popular amongst leadership thinkers because it's the future. And how do we do that? You need some kind of vertical structure, otherwise, you know, more than 10 people in a room, that you'll never come to consensus without someone finally making a decision. And on the other hand, the pyramid is really out, and people want a different way of connecting. I find that that's what keeps me up at night. Is I love that kind of thinking. How are we going to organize ourselves as human beings in the modern world? But the companies today that do this kind of a, just think about it. People are working all over the place in a network. COVID just exploded the Aquarian age to me, made it much more, relevant. And there's always going to be, for a long time, there's going to be companies that are in the Pisces structure that are, that are either big enough to just keep pushing through or have enough money or power to do that. But there's a shift, and the people that are coming into work have a different expectation, one of a matrix and not one of a pyramid. And so now there's new terms about social capital and these kind of ways of how you work in your networks. That interests me. Mm-hmm. So that would be...
But if I understand well, you were talking about kind of the middle ground being emptied and the confrontation from the two extremes.
If we are in the age, how would you organize a democracy? Because at the end of the day, you have somebody who has to decide, and this person has to have a democratic legitimacy. So how does it work when everybody is its own boss, basically?
Right, that's what we're trying to figure out, and that's part of the reason why there's such chaos. I don't have an answer to that. If I did, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be probably somewhere else. But I didn't answer your question before. I'm sorry. So to me, this new world, every single time there's been a massive breakthrough, for instance, the Renaissance, you can look, all of these breakthroughs in human consciousness or the Age of Enlightenment are followed with huge disruptions in the systems. And I think that the simplest split that's going on right now, the simplest one, call it right or left, or whatever you want to call it, is one about accepting what's new and wanting to go back to something that many people believe. I have a quote from Kennedy somewhere. He said this back in the 60s. There are always people who are afraid of progress and who are afraid of this wherever we're going and just want to go back to some utopia that never existed. But let's go back to the 50s, let's go back to the 40s. Everything was good then. Of course it wasn't, but so the real fear is like, you're moving too fast for me versus I want to go back to something that I recognize. And that's the thing. In business school, we have this example of the boogie whip maker. It's a classic example. Maybe you studied in business with the person who made the whips for the guys who ran the little cart, the boogies up and down the streets with the horse-drawn carriages. They were called boogies, and the whips. And so the guy who's making the whips is like, I'm going to make those whips. That's what we do. We've done it for 300 years, family business. All of this. That's what we do. And then someone invented a car, and suddenly they went out of business because they couldn't keep, that model was outdated. So it's just shifting, but there's a lot of tension and upheaval. Joseph Campbell said, these ages come in with violence. It's a violent disruption of systems. So everything that we know in a way is breaking down. That's really terrifying. And so you sort of have two choices. You could either be part of the questioning, where are we going, and part of creating those solutions, or you can say, I want to do whatever it takes to try to get back to a time. You can't go back in time, but you live in the past, or you live in a model that is just simply gone. And there's the whole thing of, sadness, and, I used to know everything, now I know nothing, I feel out of place. All of those emotions come with the change as well. But, the world is shifting. I have an explanation through the Aquarian age, but you can just drop that if you don't want to use that model and just look around and see everything is falling apart. But it makes total sense to me from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just one last question. Is that a generational issue as well?
Well,
so that younger people more willing to accept change, or is that still not?
Well, I think that, yes and no. I think it's also a personality thing. Some people are just very comfortable with things changing all the time, and others want things to be very, square. But in general, the kids that are growing up now, my daughter is in her 20s, they have a way, they're so much involved in this network world, they have completely different brains than my generation. I mean, they're like different creatures. And ask anybody who's a leader who says, I get these 20-year-olds coming to work for me. I had a leader say to me once, I never forgot that, he said, this is the first time in history where as a CEO, you have to know how to talk to 5 generations. It's a really interesting thought. And so, because people are working much longer, and you have these young kids coming in, and they have a completely different mind. It's a different way of thinking. It's, you know, the whole thing about hive mind and these things and hive intelligence, that's all Aquarian talk to me. And I'm very fascinated with how that's becoming much more. And AI, all of that belongs to the Aquarian age. So, and it's threatening because we're on this threshold. We have like 1 foot still in the age of Pisces. There was a lot about belief and religion and you know, and yeah. So it's a different age.
So one last question before we get into the more informal part. May I ask the Dean to...
Thank you very much, Bruno and Councilor General Swiss, for this invitation. Really thrilled to hear your presentation. Very interesting.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the leader can adapt into the 10 archetypes of people, right? Also, as a leader, you think that has the capacity to change the archetype of one person? Because in a structure as a consulate, we have a pyramid structure: the boss, vice consuls, secretaries, administration. So in that structure, do you think that we can be able to adapt or change the archetype of your co-workers, being the leader or being the general counsel in this case?
It's a really great question. And so the way I work, when I work with an organization, doesn't matter what they do, is that people come to me with a problem. So if you say to me, we've got a problem in this, if the structure is working, let's not, you know, change it. If it's working, that's fine. It may be, you know, it's working. If it's working, there's no problems, fine. But if there are problems, that's when people call me and they say, well, you know, the people who are young, they don't like the structure, they don't like the whatever it is. Then we can come in, we can work with a team and we can do consulting work. We can either, for a simple example, worked with a company, R&D department, right? So they get a big budget every year, 30 people work there, and they are tasked with coming up with new stuff. One day, leadership looks at the numbers and says, you know, we've been paying these guys for 10 years. You know, they've never done anything really meaningful. You know, we give them all this money, and what's up with this? You know, so that's a problem. So they come to us with that, what is the problem with this department? So we do an assessment on them. We find out there are nobody in the group of these 20 or 30 people has the renegade in the top 3 of their comfort level, right? So the renegade is the part that thinks outside of the box, that breaks all the rules, that does whatever she wants, that doesn't care about what other people think. And it's one that's often very low in organizations because they're afraid if I show my renegade too much, then maybe I'll get fired. On the other hand, without renegade in the modern world, it's over. I mean, it's game over. You have to think outside of the box. You have to be able to turn on the dime and so on. So then we go in and we do a renegade specific workshop for that team. So we might do it over 6 months, we might do it, you know, a couple of day seminars or 2-day seminars or something, where we essentially awaken, using theater techniques, we awaken the renegade in those 30 people, or we help the company hire somebody who's a renegade to lead the department, who's a strong renegade to lead the department. So that's the way that it works to actually develop something. But you have to come to me first with a problem. If the structure is pyramidical, and like I said, a lot of companies still do that, a lot of organizations still do that. They're not going to change in my lifetime, but maybe, you know, in 100 years that will be gone. There's always going to be some. But I'm curious in the Ubers and the Airbnbs and the disruptive companies. Listen to the word. It's a renegade word, disruption. The ones that are disrupting the status quo and the standard models, that are doing things in a completely different way. That's where I'm interested, because they're showing us where we're all going.
Just wonder whether diplomatic services could actually live with many renegades. Or because we do not have enough renegades, we are helpless when there is a renegade on the other side, like possibly Putin. We don't know how to react because we only nurture or we only kind of allow those people who are not renegades, who can suppress this part of their person, because a big hierarchy like ours doesn't live easily with renegades.
That's a really, really brilliant point. I appreciate that. And you know, In Switzerland, speaking of, us, Switzerland has an interesting history because on the one hand, yes, it's very pyramidical and very structured and polite and everything goes, but it also had Dadaism and it also had all these very renegade cultures and histories and things going on, and a lot of, Einstein, these kinds of things come from that culture as well. So there's something, I don't see the Swiss tradition and culture nearly as square as most people do who just go there to visit, because I know of the renegade mentality that it takes. So there's also something about how do you play renegade in a structure. That's part of what we're trying to figure out in this new age.
So I've heard that Dada actually comes from Lenin, who was living next to the Café Voltaire in Zurich, went to a performance and said, "Da, which in Russian means yes, yes."
Oh,
So-
that's funny. That's very funny.
So with this, Dr. Hillman, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Really nice.
Pleasure talking to you.